We are Makilala TV, the first Filipino-American TV talk show in the New York metro area. Get to know us as we talk to the community leaders, innovators, advocates, and emerging artists who affect Filipino-American life.
Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Castile, Sterling, Gurley, Liang, Ferguson, Dallas. These terms, these names, these places, they all have really strong, heavy baggage attached to them. The following episode of Makilala TV will try to explore our role as Fil-Ams, Filipinos, in between these race-based tensions, these systematic issues that basically perpetuate hate and violence. I, RACHELLE OCAMPO, and my co-hosts, Ventura and CRISTINA are joined with two special guests today, Maria Rubio and Jennine Ventura of Gabriela USA, New York, and Barrio, USA. I want to first begin this open discussion by taking a step back and recognizing that as non-Black people, we are already held with a higher sense of privilege. I am able, as a Filipino-American woman, to walk down the street without the fear of being stopped by the police every day just because the color of my skin. And I believe that many people simply just lack the sense of empathy, which builds upon their own fears and just what they just don't understand. So with that background, my first question to you, Jennine and Maria, is what does this Black Lives Matter movement mean to you personally, and why should Filipinos care?
So I think, given the context that you just laid out in terms of, framing the discussion, that is us as those who are identified as Filipinas walking in the street here in New York City, here in the United States. The reality is, though, if we broaden the scope, right, and broaden that reality and the fact that as a Pinay walking in the Philippines, right, or as a Pinay walking in Europe or in the Middle East, that what's happening here, the type of state violence and repression that's happening, that has a disproportionate effect on Black men, is something that we are those Black men in those other contexts, right? We are those Black men in the Philippines. We are those Black men in Israel. We are those Black men in Saudi Arabia, in Italy, in Germany. And so those are things that we have to recognize, right? That the privilege is really, it's within the United States context, right? Given that, especially even if we identify as Filipino Americans and as a Filipina American Pinay, that's something that we wouldn't necessarily, it's not the first thing on our minds. But that does not mean that our sisters who are the same as us, right, have the same struggles, on different levels, right? But when they're in different countries and different contexts, they are those lives that are seen as not important, right? So I think
it's really like building that connection as a Filipino woman,
right,
in those areas where basically we are those Black men,
yes,
in those areas. So
exactly.
Maria, as a mom of two colored boys, what does this movement mean to you, and why should Filipinos care or feel that it's relevant to them?
Right. So actually the first time that it had really caused an emotional stir in me was a few days ago when I had purposely not watched anything. I feel like there was a moment where I felt overwhelmed by everything that was happening. And as a mom of two little boys, I was thinking, okay, well, this is a subject that's very close to my heart that I want to act on in some way. And I would like it to be relevant to them also. But I wasn't sure of how to handle that. And so the other day I finally decided to take the blinders off and immerse myself in the media content that's available. And there was a news conference that, if I'm not mistaken, it was the widow of Alton Sterling. And when her 15-year-old son started mourning his father, I started tearing up. And my 4-year-old boy was next to me and said, "Mommy, why are you crying?" And I said, this boy just lost his father. And there are bad people in the world, and there are people that will not like you for things that you have no control over. And this is the world that we're in, and you have to understand that. And my children were raised in the Philippines. I was born and raised in New York, and we moved to the Philippines when my older son was 10 weeks old. My younger son was born there and raised there. And we've only been in New York for a year. So it's very important to me for them to understand the differences in the culture and also where they lie within it. And I feel like the current social temperament of New York, of the country, is something that we should make accessible and understandable to all people, regardless of age or race or gender. And I think that President Obama in his speech the other night said it very well when he said it's not a black or white issue, it's an American issue. And we ourselves as Filipino Americans have to realize what roles we can play and how we can help our black brothers and sisters in this struggle that they have.
When President Obama said it's not a black or white issue, it's an American issue, is that the same as saying that all lives matter?
What is behind that hashtag?
Yeah, why
all
is that
lives
such,
matter?
why is that so offensive to some people?
Right. Well, I find that for myself, a lot of people want to say all lives matter because they take away from the idea that black people are struggling. And so there is this context as a non-black person that we are not privy to, that we don't experience on a day-to-day basis. So there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of racism that is institutionalized, and it's a systematic way of people, of Americans, and the whole world at large, and how they see the world and how they value people. So for example, when we say Black Lives Matter, we're saying that we're giving them value. We're telling each other, and we're telling them that their lives are of great substance to our culture, to our lives, that they fulfill us, so we all are intertwined, and that they shouldn't be systematically reduced.
But when you have slogans like Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, I
Right.
think they create more divide than unity. Because on the other, Rochelle said that we don't experience what
Right.
African American community experience. And I don't even try to watch what happened because I can't.
It hurts your heart.
It hurts, and at the same time, you're torn between, you have the cops who are protecting
Right.
everyone.
Right.
They're not all cops are bad.
Right.
Not all African Americans are
Right.
are bad, and not all whites are are racist.
Right, right.
But with the slogans, it's kind of like when you're in social media, they're starting to create a division. I'm crying because
Right, I
people are like,
understand.
oh, okay, if you don't post anything about Black Lives Matter, then you're
With the oppressor. is the
yeah,
idea
and then
of
if you
it.
put
Yes.
all lives matter, then you're like minimizing, as you said. I mean,
Right.
some people, I better stop crying.
Why do they have to be in very stark terms?
Yeah.
I don't think, to be honest, I don't think it's a very stark term. I feel like it's a necessary action. I feel like for so long, I was raised in New York. I remember the Crown Heights riots. For so long, there have been so many divisions when it comes to race. The New York City public school system, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the most segregated within the country. So as a mom, for example, when I say I want my children to go to a good school, what does that mean? Does that mean funding? Does that mean curriculum? Does that mean that they have access to good teachers? And if that is what I mean, how do I decide that? Because for the most part, in just in everyday life, when we speak to each other and we say, oh, my kid goes to school in, and you insert a neighborhood, there's an idea
Yeah,
who they're going to school with and what they have access to. So for example, we live in Flatbush. So if I said they went to public school in Flatbush, there's a different connotation than if I were to say, my children go to school in Park Slope, right? So there's a class division, there's a race division. And I feel like because of the advent of social media in the past few years, when I left for the Philippines 6 years ago, different ballgame. We weren't as knowledgeable, we weren't as tech savvy.
They're more visual too now.
Exactly. And everything you know, you
happens
can,
instantaneously.
yeah, instantaneously you can have everything's at your fingertips.
And it's not a good thing all the time because then you don't see the whole story.
That's right. But
And
also,
so Jennine, I wanted to just circle back to you as well. In terms of like all lives matter or blue lives matter, Black lives matter. When you see other people like so vocal and you're surrounded by all these vocal and active people, what about those people who are not vocal? Like, is it a responsibility for them to speak out, to act, or is it okay for them to just try to internalize that and not post on Facebook or not Instagram it or not say, I'm at a rally, I'm here, I'm being supportive? I mean,
Yeah, you feel like you're being judged if you
Right.
don't pick a side.
yeah, the moment
and-
that you post something, you're on a
then
side.
if you do, then if you don't.
Because there are people who just like, okay, I would pray. That's the first thing. Some people say, okay, prayers won't help. But then, you know, with all this messiness that's going on, the only thing I can think of, nothing that's not logical.
Right.
But then it says to pray. And then other people say, well, then where do you stand? I mean, there's just so much ambivalence.
And there's
when
a
lot
lot of
speak
judgment,
up
I
something.
think.
Absolutely.
A lot of judgment going on.
Absolutely,
right.
yeah.
I think, you know, kind of to start back with the point that you raised, Jen, about all lives matter and Black lives matter, and like you said, blue lives matter, and that how, in your opinion, that it, you know, increases divisiveness. I just think that, you know, what we have to start with, you know, regardless of whether people are actively judging or feel like they're being actively judged, I think we have to start with at our base is education, right? I think there's nothing more divisive, you know, hashtag can't be more divisive than how it's actually playing out. Then the reality is really divisive.
Exactly.
Those statistics, the data shows in terms of the disproportionate amount of Black and Latino men that are being incarcerated, the Black and Latino men that are being victims are, you know, are fatalities as a result of instances of police brutality. So there's nothing more divisive than what the concrete issue is.
Yeah.
So I think, so in relation to the hashtag, it's not, you know, playing into the divisiveness, but it's also like shedding another perspective, another side, the fact that this is the reality, right?
Absolutely.
Like in terms of when the police come, you know, and not all police, right? But in these instances, when quick decisions have to be made in terms of when to use deadly force, which in every state has obviously like wide, broad, you know, abilities that it's within the rights of someone who's a member of law enforcement to exercise deadly force, that those decisions have these fatal and lethal consequences against certain people of color, right? So, so I think that's something to recognize, right? And the fact that this is what engenders, this is where those hashtags are born out of. The fact that there is this disproportionate amount, all of the names that you mentioned in the beginning, with the exception of Vincent Liang, like all the names that have happened as someone who also grew up, born and raised here in New York City, of Anthony Baez, of Amadou Diallo, of so many that, and all of these faces definitely were not the face of the person that shot them, right? And nor is it even reflective of the communities where a lot of people from law enforcement come from.
Yes.
So, and then they're made to police areas that they don't have any sort of communal connection, are not aware of it. Many police officers, many people in uniform don't live in New York City, so they come from Long Island, they come from Rockland, they come from Westchester. So, you know, which we know from demographic data are not reflective of these communities either in terms of diversity and even socioeconomic status. So those are things that we definitely have to bear in mind, because that's not even the subtext, that's the context that's in the consciousness of someone who's enforcing the law.
Are you familiar with this letter going on about addressing Filipino Americans of a certain generation? Dear mom and dad, auntie and uncle.
Yes.
It's like an evolving, generating.
Right.
It's
It's
like
within the
and
Asian American
then,
community.
People saying that we need to educate. Why is there a need to address a letter to Filipino Americans of a certain generation? Why do we need to educate us? I belong to
You kept saying a certain generation.
generation.
My fellow.
Are they the
My
baby
question, I
boomer
think,
generation?
is our community, I mean, people from my generation, are we a racist generation? I want you to answer as honestly as possible.
I wouldn't say.
And how would you address it if you were
Right.
to talk within your family?
Right. I think within the Filipino American community, there's definitely colorism and racism. It's just embedded after hundreds of years of colonial ties and so much oppression that we went through, and we internalized the struggles that we went through. We kind of assumed that our oppressors were correct on some levels, and you know, albeit I don't want to blame anyone for it, but it just kind of happened. And so there's definite biases towards looking a certain way, being lighter skinned, fairer skinned, having a straighter nose, you know, as opposed to being darker. And so I know in my own family, my grandmother wasn't exactly the most politically correct person. And I remember, you know, thinking, like, I can't bring any of my friends home. Like, this just can't happen. I grew up, my best friend was a black girl, and I thought to myself, like, we won't be friends anymore if my grandmother's at my house. It's just not going to happen. And, you know...
But how did your grandma, how did you know that your grandma's racist? I mean, the heads, did she openly say something?
She would say things, she was a teacher in the public school system.
Okay.
And she would make comments like, you know, those black kids and
Yeah.
how rowdy they are. And she would say to me, my only advice to you is not to be a teacher because you're going to have to deal with them and it's going to be very hard. And I remember even at a young age being like, but what do you mean? Like, that's kids. That's not black kids. Children are rowdy. Children act this way. And I remember also my parents, they didn't teach me anything about race. They kind of went, you're Filipina, deal.
There's nothing to, I feel like that there's nothing to teach because they just weren't in the, they're in a totally different environment than what we are now. Totally different. And what you were saying about colorism, I didn't even know that term existed until I started to internalize the hundreds of years of colonialism that happened to us. So there was one Filipino blogger, his name is R.V. Mendoza.
Oh, yes.
He
just posted a video.
Yes, he just posted a video. He was quoted saying, colorism is just another head of the hydra that is racism.
Yes.
And I was like, that is a really relevant analogy for me because I, as a darker skinned Filipino, grew up being told, don't go in the sun.
Yep.
Don't wear bright colors.
Right.
Use whitening soap.
Yeah.
And guess what I did? This everything.
Exactly.
I still to this day hide underneath a towel when I go to the beach.
Yeah.
But it's just so many layers of colonialism, and I think we've just been wired to talk, to feel, to see that being dark is ugly and it's wrong. And I feel like as long as we recognize that, and that we start empathizing with our colleagues, I don't see why it's okay to have a black friend, but I can't date a black person, or else it just shifts.
Right.
So,
and I feel like that idea, you know, like, so for example, that kind of idea, whether it manifests in colorism or racism, it kind of permeates everything. So for example, you know, my parents or my mother, who also worked in the public school system, but as a dietitian, and worked in Harlem. And where that came from is during the New York City fiscal crisis in the 70s. Who are you going to pay, right? If you're having difficulty placing teachers and all kinds of school staff, including dietitians, it's cheaper to pay nutritionists and dietitians from the Philippines. So my mother was part of this bigger batch of Filipinas that came to work in Harlem, in East Harlem. So, you know, so with my mother not thinking in that way, right? She's thinking, oh, I'm getting a job in New York City. This is wonderful, you know? And at the time she was living in Michigan and was a dietitian. So she's not thinking that that's the pull factor that brought her to New York City. The fact that she, as a Filipina, would earn less wages, would be less of a burden on the taxpayers of New York City than hiring, you know, American educated or white or non-Filipino dietitians here. But that same, without understanding that, she will be the same person who would say, all of these things that are happening, I mean, even though she's not around now, but say with Black Lives Matter, with XYZ Matters, if you just go to work and just do what you have to do and just stay on that path, nothing will happen to you. This won't happen to you. These people that this happened to, it's because they were in this situation.
Right.
And that's actually not true. What happened in many of these cases could have been anyone. This is like all these people that pass away are everyone's father, everyone's son, regardless if they're a person of color or if they're a Black man. The reality is anyone could be in these situations.
So how do you open the minds of Filipino Americans toward understanding the viciousness of racism?
Right.
How do you start the education?
Because you mentioned something about you grew up being told not to go out in the sun. I didn't experience that.
Oh.
I think that was Rochelle who said.
Yeah, Rochelle. I mean, cover up. I'm out in the sun.
I totally experienced
Yeah, I
that
experienced
too.
that also.
As a darker
And
person.
I'm one of the darkest in my family. Yeah, I experienced that. I was not pretty. I was not.
Right.
It was wrong.
But I know you're right. Every time I go to the Philippines, all these are the whitening products.
Aisles and aisles of it.
I guess that's a kind of way that being whiter is better than darker. But do you consider that as racism?
Absolutely.
Totally.
Just think about, why is being dark ugly?
Right.
Because it's so funny. Because in the U.S., all my friends, I grew up
They
in a
wanna
white
tan.
neighborhood. They all want to go tanning. I'm like, really?
That's what I said. I don't think being. Maybe I'm so detached.
Right.
That I don't think they told me that being dark is ugly. So maybe
They didn't say it.
They didn't have to say it though.
It was
because
dark.
It was
maybe
an
they're concerned.
understanding.
They're concerned that it's
I
health
think the message
issues.
is subliminal.
Yeah,
Right.
it wasn't.
Yeah.
It
It's
was
an
an
overt
They won't
thing.
tell
Yeah,
you
they won't say,
exactly.
okay, don't go in the sun because you'll get sunburned. No, you'll get
darker.
You'll get
right.
darker. Why
Right.
can I be
So
darker?
automatically darker is bad. Right?
Yeah.
Is the
Exactly.
message
Which is
that goes
weird
down.
because you also raised in a Catholic, very religious. We're a very religious
Yeah,
country, and
absolutely.
you're supposed to have love and not hate.
Right.
And
But when my parents are saying this, they don't think, okay, I'm going to raise my child as a good Catholic. I'm going
Right.
to raise her as a lighter Catholic. Doesn't
Right.
it doesn't connect to each other.
Right.
I see. And also I'm thinking, my parents came to America for a better life for myself and my siblings, right? So in their heads, what can I do to make my children's lives easier in America?
Yes.
And when you
Yeah.
think of who makes it in America, when I go to the Philippines and we talk about Americans, automatically people in the Philippines assume we're talking about white people.
Right.
Because Americans, that is synonymous with white people in the Philippines. So as a Filipino and a Filipina, my parents would come here and think, all right, my children are going to make it. Pull up from your bootstraps and hard work, and as long as you do what you have to do and you study and you go to school and you don't cause any trouble, you will succeed and have the American dream, right? And so that is the dream they had for us, and so
Right.
they instilled in us all of these values that they assumed would help us to get that dream, to
Right.
attain that.
That is so nuts.
And a lot of that is, going to the right schools. And like we said earlier, what is the right school? Looking a certain way, talking a certain way. I
Not
grew
having an
up
accent.
exactly. I grew up, and I grew up in the '90s, listening to hip hop and talking a certain way. My parents would be like, "That's not respectable. That's not how we talk." And so, even though it's not an explicit message of Black people are not as good as us, implicitly that's there, and I feel like we bury those messages within all of these other conversations where I feel like our generation now, because of social media, because we're so much more aware, we can now talk about these things openly,
Right.
which is why we have the hashtag Black Lives Matter, because our generation is more open to it, and we can have these conversations, even though they're very painful, very uncomfortable conversations.
Are you having these conversations with your parents right now?
So for me, for example, so I went away to school, and then when I came back, I remember having a conversation with my father, and he asked about some of my high school friends, and one of whom is Filipina, and I said, oh, she's dating this man who's pursuing his doctorate in computer engineering. And my father's like, oh my God, that's amazing. And, and out of nowhere, he's like, oh, what's his ethnicity, And I'm like, he's Haitian. And my father's like, he's Black. And I'm like,
He's Indian?
yeah, I mean, he's Haitian. And he was like, oh my God. And I'm like, you just liked him 2 seconds ago because he's getting his doctorate in computer engineering.
Right.
And my father, education doesn't matter. He's like, he said education isn't everything.
That would have been a good opening.
And it totally was, yeah.
So did you talk about Black Lives Matter?
So moving forward, I kind of said, I'm like, I don't understand that. I was like, so would you prefer for me to, I mean, and not that education is everything, but would you rather me date someone who is like on drugs or what have you, and doesn't have a GED and is Pinoy? Is that all right? And
or white?
And then I can't go there. I'll say Pinoy. So my father's like, education isn't everything. Like, reiterated that. Yeah. And then we continued to have that conversation. That was like freshly when I graduated from college, and my father was totally freaked out about whatever path I would take. Yeah. But finally one day he's like, I'm okay if you date a black man, and it's kind of like, you should, you have to unlearn that, and where does that come from, and I hate to refer to colonial mentality because that's something that we refer to all the time, but I just think that it really comes from the idea when you have migrant parents, or Filipinos who came here, they're like, why would we want to align with anyone who is who is detracting from that path, the sole reason why I came here. Exactly. But we have to think of ourselves, it's not like that. That's backwards thinking. Forwards thinking is that we're all linked up in this struggle together. We all, like what had happened with migrant workers here, in terms of Jim Crow, happened to Filipino, all the Filipinos who came to California. Many of them also were victimized by the same laws.
If we were to talk to our parents right now, what would be one thing that you could want to relay to them about this movement? Like, why is it about us?
And explain, how do you deal with the Dallas issue? Like, what happened there with the cops being shot? And there we go, I'm crying again. How do you deal with your kids? This is not for me.
It's a strong emotion.
You
should go back to stroke.
So we are closing it up very briefly, but I wanted to just close it up in terms of like, what would be a message to your parents, to your loved ones who just don't understand what's happening? Even I am still trying to process this because I have loved ones who are in law enforcement, and I think about them every day when I wake up, hoping that they get home safe. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, he signed up for that job." Black people are born with that that issue. So I have a lot of back and forth myself. So for you two, what is one thing that you would like to relate to your parents to help them understand?
I think for myself in particular, what really did it for me was to think of my children being raised in this country. And, they say that parents love their kids, but they love their grandkids. And they really love their grandkids. And so that's really what I stress with my parents in particular. My children are living in this world where people want to say that we're post-racism, post-feminism, and all this, and it's just not the case. Right. It's just not the case. And, and it helps me to, put my kids front and forward and to say, listen, this is the world they're in, and they have to learn how to navigate it. So we have to face facts, and this is what's going on in the world.
Like one quick story is, I was with a friend of mine who is black, he's Guyanese, and we went together to get an engagement ring for my other friend. And when we were exiting the tunnel, because we were in Jersey, we're exiting the Lincoln Tunnel, and by accident, he didn't know which lane to go in, so he veered into this lane and then quickly had to switch off. And then we get pulled over by the Port Authority police. And just that simple thing, when a Port Authority police officer approached the car, he already had his hand on this holster, walking the whole time, just from veering like this. And, and I'm like, oh my God, is this really happening? And he was very gruff without even asking questions. So the thing is, that common day instance, like what would have been the difference had we switched, had I been behind the wheel and he was in the front passenger seat, and that's his reality as like a Harvard educated man who's just who just accidentally switched from a lane with an engagement ring for his fiance. Like, you know what I'm saying? And so those are things that is important for us to remind our parents, whether or not we witness those instances, that these are everyday people, and as everyday people, we need to link arms with them. This is not something that is separated from us in our lives.
So thank you again, Maria and Jennine, for taking the time on short notice to join us and sharing your thoughts. So thank you again on behalf of Makilala TV.